Good morning, everybody. I'm excited to lead this panel. My panel is entitled, Are We Ready to Accelerate Open RAN Deployments at Scale and Kickstart Industrialization? And we have a really nice panel, and I'm going to start by having each panelist introduce themselves.
All right, I can go first. Thanks, Julie. This is Anil Kollipara from Spirent Communications. I'm the VP of Product Management for our test and automation portfolio, responsible for our product lines and solutions in the 5G, O-RAN, cloud, and security areas. A lot of background in the test and measurement in both lab and operations. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Yep.
Thank you, Anil.
I can go next. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're based. Thank you for taking the time to tune into this session. Appreciate it. I would also like to thank RCR Wireless for conducting this Open RAN forum, especially at this juncture where we are seeing some great success with Open RAN in North America and are now seeing the momentum build up in Europe and Asia. It's a pleasure to share the panel with Saurabh and Anil and moderated by Julie, who are all telco stalwarts. Very happy to be here. So I'm Prakash Desai, currently at Wind River, managing the studio portfolio for operators. For those of you who are not aware, Wind River Studio offers a comprehensive, fully cloud-native Kubernetes platform integrated, integrated with orchestration engine and ML analytics capabilities that can host telco and enterprise applications. So prior to joining Wind River, I spent 20 plus years at Motorola and Nokia, working in various roles. My telecom journey started when 3G was just being standardized. So from 3G to 4G to 5G, the journey has been nothing but amazing. I look forward to gaining some valuable insights from our session today. Thank you.
Thank you, Prakash. And Saurabh?
Yep. Thank you, Julie. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and namaste from India. Thank you to RCR Wireless for inviting me to this exciting session. I'm Saurabh. I'm the head of standards and technology ecosystem at Bharti Airtel. And I also look after the O-RAN related initiative from Bharti Airtel. For those who may be less familiar with Airtel, Airtel is now one of the top 3 telcos globally. And we run about 550 million subscribers across 17 countries in India, Southeast Asia, Africa, and some footprint in Europe as well. And in India, which is our biggest operations, we run 2G, 4G, 5G, and we have about 300K physical cell sites of 4G and about 100K plus cell sites in 5G. Very excited to be here on this panel and look forward to speaking. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, let's just keep that same order that we did for intros for each of these questions. So the first question is, are we ready to accelerate Open RAN deployments at scale and kickstart industrialization? We'll start with Anil.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's an apt question for where we are as an industry today. And if you think of Open RAN as a technology or a product from a lifecycle perspective, we've done a great job until now, right? We are in the early market phase, so the kinds of things that are important in this phase, the kinds of metrics that are important in this phase, we've done a great job. We've made sure that the technology is valuable. We made sure it's feasible, and working on the viability aspect of it. We have great metrics like 40 plus suppliers, vendors and suppliers that Open RAN introduced. So that's what's a great highlight, that the technology is attracting talent outside of the traditional RAN space. We have 50 plus successful POCs and trials already completed, again, proving that the feasibility of the technology is there and the customer interest is there. And also we have some really large commercial commitments and contracts in place. The most notable one being from AT&T, the $14 billion order for Ericsson and Fujitsu and other Open RAN players. We have commitments from Vodafone, Deutsche Telekom, you name it. We have quite a few of these in the pipeline. But if you look at where we are now, and we are facing the mainstream, right? The industrialization aspect of it. And the biggest challenge we have is the chasm that is in front of us. So what worked for us until now is not going to work for us going forward, right? We have to think of different metrics, and the metrics being, do we have the right TCO? Do we have the right performance parity with the traditional RAN? Do you have deployments beyond rural to urban and dense areas? And finally, what is the share of Open RAN as a percentage of the total RAN spend? Those are the things that we're going to try focus on. And industrialization is the most important aspect to achieve those kinds of metrics. So to think about how do we make sure that our Open RAN as a technology is performant and robust enough to attract and meet the requirements of the customers.
Thanks so much. And you actually kind of started to answer the TCO question from the chat, but we'll get back to that in a little bit later after we get through the initial 3 questions that I have here. So Prakash, if you could answer this, the question again, just to remind you, is where with Open RAN today, and what are the challenges to realize Open RAN's full potential and deployment at scale?
Thank you, Julie. I'll echo what Anil said. I think the journey has just begun, right? I mean, Open RAN as a technology is proven beyond doubt. Since Anil, mentioned some of the names, some of the tier 1 CSPs, let me look at the Wind River customer base that we have today. Right? We have seen great success with Verizon and TELUS in North America. Anil, you mentioned Vodafone in UK. They have been one of the first ones to deploy a fully Open RAN network in the UK. They are in fact expanding into properties outside of Europe now. Telefonica has started deploying in Germany. We have KDDI and SoftBank in Japan. We have multiple trials going on in Asia and Middle East. And like you mentioned, if I look outside of Wind River, AT&T was a big announcement, especially in the Open RAN space. We have similar announcements coming in from Docomo in Japan, right? So if you look at all these tier 1 CSPs, these are big names. They have already embraced Open RAN, but definitely the adoption and the scale is not as fast as you would like, right? So while the technology is proven and mature, I would say some aspects such as TCO, operations at scale, interoperability amongst the ecosystem partners, I think that needs some work. So while this is happening in the CSP space, if you look at the telco OEMs, not only are they developing open interface radios, but they are now actively promoting Open RAN, the likes of Nokia and Samsung and Ericsson, right? So that's a big change. So we are also seeing new vendors, like Anil pointed out, 40 plus new players in the market, whether it is server vendors, chipset, NIC cards, cloud platform, including hyperscalers who were never in telco before, right? So I think to sum up, a lot of momentum, a lot of ecosystem expansion, the timing is right, the technology is proven. I think we should see some commercialization take up in the next couple of years.
Okay, so interesting prediction with a couple years is when you think that's a very interesting prediction. Okay, we'll go to Saurabh next.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. And I think the most important question that we have. Maybe Prakash and Anil mentioned about 40 plus customers. I can tell you on the other side of the table, I mean, at the operator side, what kind of a challenge introduces when we have 40 plus suppliers to actually look at in terms of building this kind of an ecosystem. Maybe let me step back and then give you a perspective from what has been our experience so far. We've been working on Open RAN, virtualized disaggregated networks, I mean, for past several years. And when we started, I think we were very clear we didn't want this to be a science project. We wanted this to be a commercially viable project, program that essentially actually becomes an important part and share of, as Anil mentioned, of the overall ecosystem onto that part. We started with small cell. We kind of pivoted to the macro cell because on the 5G especially, and we have like several sites which are running on Open RAN based traffic, taking massive traffic. I mean, in terms of live commercial traffic, And these are based on massive MIMO, but there are like challenges. From an operator perspective, if you look at our North Star are two, right? I mean, we have on one side from Airtel perspective, we have brilliant customer experience that we want to give to our customers, and then we have the cost to serve, right? We want to provide this at the lowest possible cost. So in our view, the Open RAN technology essentially has to enable the deliveries on these North Star onto this piece. And what we see is that there are like several stages which essentially go through in any new technology for that matter, but more so from an Open RAN perspective, which is, after it has been done by different set of suppliers, but when it gets to an operator environment, you have a lab testing validation stage, you have a field validation stage, and then you have an industrialization stage, right? Which is where we need to put together all the ecosystem in terms of the integration into my OSS, BSS platform, how I run operations, how I actually scale and deploy for example, just to illustrate, right? At Airtel, we probably, last year we deployed 1,000 sites per day kind of scenario, right? So is, for example, Open RAN now to the level of maturity that we can actually scale at that level. I think that becomes very important, for example, onto that part. So we need to, look at the very important aspect, the industrialization, and of course, the three big bucket item always remain in terms of the performance parity, stability part of it, the TCO comparison, and then the life cycle sustenance part, right? So once we get those three stages, then we need to really ensure that we are doing a tick box in all these three areas, because if this is not, the networks are supposed to be put off for long cycles. So I think to my mind, even that's very important part of the problem that we need to really address if Open RAN has to really scale fast and rapidly into the networks. Thank you.
Okay, and I want to just ask a follow-up for you, actually, before we go on to my next question that I have already planned for Saurabh. So there's a couple of questions in the chat that deal with this total cost of ownership. And on the one hand, one person is kind of saying it's more complex, the software, the traditional, monolithic vendors. On another hand, somebody else asked a question that maybe it's easier. Maybe the total cost of ownership is easier with multi-vendor Open RAN, that you don't have to do rip and replace. You're not tied to these longer cycles, that you can do more continuous development, continuous integration, that type of thing. So I was wondering what your take on it as an operator is on that, and also in relation to that, some of the total cost of ownership has to do with these cycles of how often you update your network, like maybe every 5 years. So if you're not quite at that cycle, how does that fit into the total cost of ownership? So I'm just going to take a break and ask you that question. I'll ask the other panelists as well, but I thought it might be interesting to start from an operator perspective. Yeah.
Of course, Julie. I think that, and that's a very important question. I would say that I don't have the full answer to that piece. But my 2 cents on this, these two parts, and both the statements which I saw in the chat box are actually correct. I think the first piece which came in, that if you have so many multi-vendor environment, is the TCO a problem? And I would say, frankly, at this stage, probably yes. In the initial stage, it would look like that it is kind of a problem. I have the suppliers on the calls as well, but it's just that if you have too many players, there is always a margin stacking, double dipping on the margin stacking. I think that's one part of the equation, cost equation, which comes into picture. I think the second part which comes into picture is the integration cost and the life cycle cost. Sometimes it's kind of not so much looked into, right? People tend to underestimate that part. But we have seen that, it takes a considerable effort to really put together the solution and then maintain this, right? The operators, may have in-house team, or they may rely on the suppliers or system integrators, but there's an additional cost component which does come into picture on the initial stages. The second comment which comes in that, won't it be cheaper over a life cycle? I think we have to see how things essentially really will materialize onto that part. There is a merit in the argument, right? Because we do see that, at times when we want to do a single RAN solution, for example, and you have, and the networks are dynamic in nature, right? We acquire a lot of spectrum over a period of time, different periods of time. And then, if we are actually having different suppliers' equipment, If the Open RAN is there, of course, it's better and possible to integrate them together, right, without doing rip and replace. So I think there is a merit into that argument, but how much this turns into reality, because what we have seen is that people have their own perspective in terms of how these different integrations can be done, right? So I think we'll probably have to see onto that part. There are various models which essentially operators have been trying. I would say, I mean, right from building teams to essentially manage the complexity and the TCO. Because then if you choose the components well, and as a large telco providers, there is a leverage which is available, and there is a possibility to get to a good solution. To the other extreme, where you have an open RAN based solution, but we let some supplier take the front end, right? I mean, in our opinion, for example, the software guys, they become the real natural stakeholder to take, for example, more control of the value chain. So there could be like all these options which can be tried out. I think in different markets, different solution probably will be more feasible depending upon the operator's maturity and, excuse me, their business models. Thank you.
Okay, and that's a perfect lead into the other two members of this panel to answer this TCO question, because you mentioned managing, choosing components, how will the integration be done? And the other two people on this panel are good to answer that question. So let's start with, let's go to Anil as a test vendor. How do you see managing that TCO?
Yeah, and I'm fortunate to be a part of the test ecosystem, because we talk to hundreds of customers across the vendor ecosystem, the chipset, and operators like Saurabh and Bharti, and Saurabh touched on this as well. If you look at from a TCO perspective, well, before we talk about TCO, the premise of Open RAN has been to avoid vendor lock-in, right? That was one of the founding principles of why Open RAN started. So having all these different suppliers, and this is great. This is addressing that very specific aspect of it. But it does introduce a lot of challenges, right? In terms of, some of the suppliers are mature, some of the suppliers are just coming into this Open RAN or RAN area in general. And as you know, RAN is the most sensitive part of of the network, and in fact, any technology. I talk about that when I talk to people from other industries. So what happens is that we have and now when you look at it from a TCO perspective, you're not only comparing against the traditional RAN in terms of price per performance, right? There is one aspect of TCO where you're comparing price per performance of Open RAN and traditional RAN. That is one question. But the second is, within Open RAN itself, you will see that there is significant performance differences between the players, the vendors, right? And we're actually I'm going to talk about that in a session. We've done a performance comparison between two separate vendors, and you can see that there is significant differences, and that translates into TCOs, whether it's throughput or coverage. That translates into TCO. So that's the second part of it. And the third part of it, this is the operational complexity, right? So because of all these different vendors, all of these different moving parts, both horizontal, what I call it as the RU, DU, CU, RIC, and the core network, as well as the vertical part of it, which is the chipset. You have the operating system, you have the cloud layer, and Prakash can definitely talk about that. All of these things introduce a lot of complexities. And we've done actually a calculation that Open RAN, because of the number of vendors, the number of interfaces, and the number of updates that are expected, the complexity has increased 100x or more compared to traditional RAN. And the only way that you can address that is through a complete lifecycle management, through a complete automation approach, where all the changes or any changes that are coming in from any part of the ecosystem go through a complete, testing cycle, right? And Prakash touched about this lifecycle management. And I just want to give you one more example. I was in Delhi a few months ago when the whole CrowdStrike thing happened. I was at the airport, right? Although CrowdStrike thing is not to do with anything to do with telecom, but think about it. Any change, that is introduced in the supplier, if it just escapes this lifecycle management and gets into the production network, it has large ramification. So having the life cycle management approach as the only approach to manage this operational complexity is a must. And that's when you would see the ROI and the TCO get under control and addressed.
Well, that's very, very interesting that you kind of broke it into the three parts, and especially the 100 times more complex. So, Prakash, could you weigh in on this TCO question?
Yeah, that's the million or more dollar question, definitely. I agree with what Saurabh and Anil both mentioned, right? I mean, they talked about and touched about a lot of points. So if you take a step back and look at where this disaggregation, this whole Open RAN notion came into picture, is to do a few things. One is break that hardware and software, introduce more vendors, and ironically, actually, the whole purpose of reducing that competition, or sorry, increasing that competition, was to bring down the price of deployment, right? And the real competition, when we talk about the cost or the performance, we are comparing it to traditional RAN, right? Now we have to know that when it comes to reliability and performance, the macro networks are considered the gold standard, right? I mean, they have gone through decades of R&D and optimization, and they're rock solid with finite availability, right? So the benchmark for us to perform, for Open RAN to perform, is these traditional RAN networks that are deployed today, right? Now we have that advantage of in Open RAN that the carriers can actually pick and choose the best of the breed components. But I think what is lacking is standardization, right? The more and more we have these open radio interface standardized, all the different interfaces amongst these different networks that Anil talked about, right from the edge all the way into core and even into the management framework like SMO. I think once that standardization happens fully, and then we have different vendors deploying a fully standardized network elements, interoperability will definitely become easier, right? And then what we need is blueprints that actually provide a full stack integrated approach that right from infrastructure to cloud platform to telco applications, here is a stack that's fully validated, fully standardized, ready for deployment, right? And now you have that deployment at scale. And then like both Saurabh and Anil touched at, I think automation is the key. If, like Saurabh mentioned, you're deploying 1,000 sites a day, there is no way we can have that done manually. Automation is the only answer, right? And we see that. I mean, today we have customers who have deployed 20, 30, 40,000 nodes of Open RAN, and especially like day two operations, upgrade and update is the key when it comes to TCO optimization. And all our roadmap is actually built for operations at scale. So it is happening, but when it comes to scale economies, I think the more and more carriers adopt Open RAN, we see like every carrier deploying tens of thousands of nodes, I believe there will definitely be an impact on TCO. So the TCO will come down. We are not there today, but hoping it will happen.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to kind of combine my next question with one of the questions that I saw in the chat. So one of the questions in the chat is, now that we've proven the technology for Open RAN in practice, what can we do? What's the major challenges over scale to deploy at scale over the next couple of years? I mean, we had that prediction of in 2 years, maybe we will have deployment at scale, and that I want to combine those challenges over the next few years also with performance parity. We haven't really touched on performance parity. Is performance parity to traditional RAN one of the major issues? I'm going to actually start with you, Prakash, because you just mentioned some of the things like standardization, blueprints, automation, that type of thing. But what other things do you think, to get there in a couple years?
Yeah, great question, Julie, and thank you for that. So every network is different. But in my experience, one thing that I've seen common when it comes to dealing with all the carriers is that it boils down to 3 P's, okay? Number one is price. How much does it cost to deliver a gig of data over certain megahertz of spectrum, right? Is my network optimized for TCO? That's price, first P. Second P is performance. Is my network better than the competition? Am I giving the best user experience to my subscribers, right? And the third P is power, which is basically kind of rolled up into price. But I think with the energy crisis we had in Europe, it kind of needs special attention by itself. So how much energy does my cell site consume, right? So price, performance, and power are the 3 Ps that determine how your network is measured against. And of course, like I mentioned, the traditional RAN. So all the KPIs, whether it is call setup success rate, call drop rate, throughput, user experience, all that is compared to traditional RAN. With the different, different things I mentioned about, like choosing the best of the breed components, having a blueprint, doing left shift with all the partners involved in the ecosystem so that the interoperability and the testing and validation happens early on, continuous collaboration with all the partners, right from design all the way through deployment to optimization. I think all of this will lead to making sure that there is a parity with the traditional RAN, right? So I think the goal is to build a flexible and scalable solution that is built to open standards, having a full stack blueprint optimized for price, performance, and power is probably the way to go to meet the benchmark set by the traditional RAN networks.
I like the 3 Ps. I've heard it said different ways, but I haven't quite heard it said that way. That was very interesting. So we have 5 minutes, so I'll give the other 2 panelists a chance to answer. Let's see. I guess we'll go to Anil next.
Yeah, that's Prakash, you covered quite a few aspects of this question. But the way I would add or complement that would be to make performance as a centerpiece, right? It's the focus. So far from a standardization perspective, and all the activities that we have carried out before have been around, getting things working together, the functional aspects of it, the conformance aspect of it. Interoperability, right? And all the activities that happen in the OTIC labs and all in the industry have been to prove that part, and we've proven that, right? The focus needs to shift, and if we make performance as the focus, we need to think about standardizing certain performance standards, and these could be against the traditional RAN or as per the operator's objectives in terms of the performance in the urban areas versus rural areas based on the deployment models. We need to make performance as the front and center. And the second part of it is that we are talking about industrialization. So it's not just performance. That is absolutely the number one. But the second aspect of this is stability and robustness, right? So you want to make sure that you focus on the scalability, that this technology and the Open RAN system is robust in the live network, and it can operate under real world RF conditions. There's very complex situations and scenarios. It can operate under real world applications when millions of subscribers are on the network, is the network and all the performance aspect of it, it's able to handle. So that's a big part of it. And then the third is this lifecycle management we talked about, right? So making sure that anything and everything that is changing in the network or in the Open RAN ecosystem goes through this life cycle to make sure that all of these things, the performance aspect, the compliance, capacity, performance, and the security aspects are tested continuously. And you're putting something in the network that is proven and is not going to impact your subscribers.
Okay, yeah, I like that with the stability, robustness, and security. So that is something we hadn't quite got to yet. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. So I think we probably will just have time for Saurabh to answer the last question, or this question, and we'll see how we do for time. But it looks like we have just time for you to answer. 3 minutes left.
No, thanks, Julie. I think I'll pick up from what Anil said, and I'll probably be a little bit more honest about the state of affairs, right? If you look at the performance of a macro RAN network, and Prakash said that's the gold standard, and then we essentially have deployed massive MIMO, and we see that when you have the 5G, mid-band spectrum, the massive MIMO is the way to go for handling massive capacities. It's an incredibly complex software. I think sometimes this is a little bit underestimated, the complexity of that software, which has essentially been evolved and kind of optimized by the large traditional players over a considerable amount of time. So the disruptors who essentially came in the open RAN space, I would say that they have done very good job. But are they there to match the traditional players? I think, in my opinion, probably answer is somewhat gray. I mean, you can't definitely say that that's something which is there. And Anil also, I think, was alluding to that fact that that's something something which has to be really tested and validated. Because when it comes to the real world performance, I think that's where that's where the rubber hits the road, and you need to really have the right kind of a performance. Because for us, the performance and stability comes before anything else, right? I mean, you can discuss the TCO only when something is materially really working onto that part. I think that's something which is, I mean, really important. And the life cycle part, I think again, this is, I just wanted to underscore that part. Because what we see is that, I mean, matching the life cycle of different component is, and again, not at all easy part. You'll have, and pardon me, Prakash, just to, I mean, take Wind River an example, right? You have a cache layer coming from Wind River. You have hardware coming from another, I mean, 2, 3 different chipset suppliers. You have the RAN application coming from another set of suppliers. And these are like, I mean, big companies of their own, right? How do they align their own product life cycle recycles is not an easy problem to solve, right? So I think as an industry within Open RAN, we need to be, I mean, honest and admit that that's a problem that we have to solve, so that we are able to scale to the real factor. And I mean, we're good to see good progress happening all around. And I mean, looking forward to how the overall ecosystem evolves. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for the wonderful panel, and hopefully we will see this deployed at scale and industrialized in 2 years, according to one of your predictions. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.